everyone, and welcome to our Princeton Review live stream for the AP Literature exam. My name is Gina Donegan. I'm a longtime teacher for the Princeton Review, and I'm here to give you lots of tips and tricks to help you to be successful on the AP. This is the first video in a three-part series on the English literature test. So thank you so much for joining me. And let me just give you a little overview of what we're going to cover today. We're first going to talk about all of the general important things you need to know for this year's English literature exam, especially given some of the changes that we have now that we may be taking a digital exam. So I'm going to give you all the inside details you need on the differences between the paper test and the digital test and when you might be taking it. We're also going to talk about how you can prepare, the most important knowledge that you need for this test, and then how to generally approach the essays. And remember, we will have 3 of these live streams. So whatever we don't cover today, we'll definitely get to in our next 2. And finally, at the end, I'll give you a sense of how the Princeton Review might be able to help you with your prep. So if you have any questions, I would encourage you to type those into the chat field. And we have a helpful moderator here named Shadna, who's going to look at your questions and pass them on to me. So I'd be happy to chat about anything you want today. So let's first start with the most important information, which is when you're going to take the English literature exam and what type of exam you'll be taking. First of all, as you may know, there are 2 AP English tests. One of them is called the AP English Language Test, but the one we're talking about today is the English Literature Test. And hopefully you know which one you're scheduled to take. If you're not sure, just ask your teacher. But there's a good chance if you're here today, you are taking the literature test. You just want to double check and make sure you've got the right one. So if you're taking the literature test, there are 3 possible dates in which you might take it. Most people will be taking it on Wednesday, May 5th. And that's 8 a.m. in the morning. So that's bright and early when you first arrive at school, you'll be taking the literature exam. That is a traditional paper and pencil exam. So that means you'll be sitting at a desk with a test booklet in front of you. You'll be circling things in the test booklet, bubbling in answers on a bubble sheet, and you'll be hand writing all of your essays with a pen. So this is exactly like the kind of AP literature test that people would have taken 2 years ago. But there are 2 other dates in which you might be taking this test also, and another possible format. If you're taking the AP literature test on Tuesday, May 18th, or on Tuesday, June 1st, then there are 3 different ways you might take the test. You might be taking a traditional paper and pencil exam. That's possible. But you could also be taking a digital exam either in school or even possibly at home. And there are some important differences between the paper test and the digital test. So we're going to talk about those tonight. And if you are taking the test at home online, then obviously it's going to be really important for you to have a reliable computer, good internet connection, and you should get information about all those technical specifications before you take it. What it really comes down to is whether your school is functioning as normally, some schools are, or if your school is completely shut down, you might be one of those people taking the AP at home. If your school is on a sort of hybrid schedule, that's when your school may opt for the paper test, but may also opt for digital. So basically, every school has flexibility to choose a date and choose a format. And so you need to find out from your AP teacher, if you don't already know, when you're scheduled to take the test, but also whether it's going to be paper or digital, because you want to be able to practice accordingly. And finally, you can access your own registration information at myap.collegeboard.org. So check that out at some point if you haven't already. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the digital exam, because first of all, the actual content in terms of the actual questions and essay questions will be the same, whether you're taking this on a piece of paper or on a computer. But there are some important rules for people taking it on the computer. First of all, unfortunately, you are not allowed to do any skipping around within the multiple choice section. On the paper test, you can skip around as much as you want in the multiple choice section. You can answer the questions in any order that works for you. But unfortunately, that's not the case on the digital test. So what it means is you're just going to have to be a little bit more careful. Make sure that you read the question carefully, read all 5 of the answers. Before you pick an answer, just make sure you really understood the question and you were clear about what your answer was saying. Because once you click on that answer and you choose like the submit button and you send your answer, you unfortunately cannot go back to that question again. And of course, you can't skip ahead. So this is not necessarily an awful thing. You know, a lot of people tend to do a lot of the questions in order anyway. So this may not be a big change from how you would do it on paper, but it's just something good to know about before you sit and do the digital test. You're not allowed to do any searching for things on Google or looking things up in books or notes. That's simply not going to be allowed on this year's test. But frankly, the questions aren't going to involve questions of that kind anyway. There's not going to be a whole lot that you need to look up anywhere. And even though there are a few basic literary terms that you need to know, you can certainly spend a little time learning those before the test and you'll be fine. As a matter of fact, today I'm going to give you what I think are the most important literary terms and devices that you can add to your notes. It's also good to know that on the digital test, there will be security features that will prevent you from collaborating with other people or accessing things online or, heaven forbid, having somebody else take the test for you. None of those things would be a good idea, right? And particularly, this is designed for the people taking the test at home. So taking the AP at home gives you a lot of freedom, but it means that there will still be ways of making sure that you don't get any help. For instance, I'm pretty sure that the College Board is going to be tapping into your webcam and your microphone to just kind of make sure that nothing funky is going on. They may also do things like check out how quickly you typed your essay just to make sure you weren't cutting and pasting things randomly, that sort of thing. So if you're taking the test at home, just make sure that you bone up on all the rules, all the technical specifications, and make sure you take the test in a really quiet area of your house where you won't be disturbed and where you won't have any other things to deal with. Another good thing to note is that your essays will be reviewed with plagiarism detection software. So obviously, I don't think anybody in this room would plagiarize, but in case there's anyone who's tempted to do so, the College Board has measures to find out whether you've done that. And of course, you really can't plagiarize when you're taking a paper and pencil test and you're writing with a pen and your teacher's watching you. But even on the digital test, you know, you shouldn't do that even if you're tempted to. So there are some downsides to the digital exam, but I also think there are some major upsides. For instance, if you're taking the test on a computer, you can type your essays instead of handwriting them. That's a little less tiring, and most people are used to typing things all the time anyway. So that's a major advantage. And you also have access to something that's like a highlighter tool where you can highlight parts of the passages if you need to. And you're allowed to use scratch paper because obviously you're not writing in the test booklet, but you can use scratch paper if you need to write things down. I've even heard that there's a little feature in the digital exam where you can take notes in a text box directly on the passage if you want to. So that's kind of a nice feature too. And so for any of you who just came in, welcome. My name is Gina Donegan, and we are talking about the AP English Literature exam. If you have any questions for me, just feel free to type those into the chat and I'd be happy to answer them. So now let's talk a little bit about how the exam is scored, and we'll also look at the overall structure of the test too. So in terms of the scoring, the way it works is fairly simple in the multiple choice section. You earn 1 raw point for every question that you answer correctly. It doesn't matter if it's an easy question, a hard question, they're all worth 1 point. And you don't earn any points for questions that you leave blank. And what if you get something wrong? Well, if you get something wrong, you simply don't earn a point for it, but you don't lose any points for wrong answers. There's no guessing penalty, as they call it. So what that means is you should never leave anything blank in the multiple choice section, right? Even if you're running out of time, you should still pick answers for your remaining questions because there's no risk and you might in fact get some of them right. Now, the multiple choice section is going to count for approximately half of your overall AP score. The other half of your AP score is determined by your performance on 3 free response essays. Each one of these essays is scored on a scale of 0 to 6, with 6 being the best score. Now, realistically, it's more like 1 to 6. The only way you can get a 0 is if you don't write an essay or if you write about something completely off topic. But as long as you're putting in some sort of effort, you're going to get at least a 1. And of course, the highest score is a 6. The average score is about a 3 or a 4 on each essay. So let's talk about how the overall AP is scored. All AP exams are scored in pretty much the same way, which is on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. A 5 is a perfect score. So that means that you got most of the multiple choice questions right and you got really high scores on the essays. Only about 10% of the people who take the test get a 5. So if you don't wind up with a 5, don't feel too bad about that because most people don't get 5s. And in fact, a score of 4 is considered really good on the AP. If you get a 4, you did a great job. And so people who get the 4s and 5s are, roughly 25 to 30% of the people who take the test. A 3 is about an average score, so it means you're kind of in the middle. A 1 or a 2 is not considered a very good score, and it probably means that you might not have put a lot of time into prep. So I would expect that almost everybody in this room, if you're here and you care about this test and you're going to study for it, you're probably going to get at least a 3. So the goal is to push you up to at least a 4 or a 5, right? That's what we always want if we can get it. Now, why do these scores matter to you? Well, first of all, they often don't affect your grade in your English class, but they could affect you in other ways. For instance, a lot of colleges will actually give you college credit if you score a 4 or a 5 on the AP exam. So, for example, if your college requires you to take freshman English, well, if you get a 4 or a 5 on the English literature test, they might say you don't need to take freshman English. So you can use it to satisfy core requirements and also just to earn actual credits at the college that you're attending. You could actually save some money by taking AP exams and getting high scores. And then, of course, you could possibly even use this somehow in admissions. It just looks good to have AP classes on your transcript, right? And so a lot of people will take these classes for that reason. So there are good reasons to care about the AP. So everyone who's here wants to get a good score. So now let's just talk about what you can expect on test day. Whether you're taking the paper exam or the digital exam, the test will be the same. The only difference is the rules of the game, right? Whether you can skip around or not, etc. The test will take approximately 3 hours. Section 1 is a multiple choice section that lasts for 60 minutes, and there are a total of 55 questions. So if you think about it, that's not a lot of time. And that's going to include reading both fiction passages and poetry. And so this section of the test accounts for about 45% of your overall AP score. Section 2 is free response essays. This accounts for 55% of your overall AP grade. And the 3 essays always come in a particular order. The first one is called poetry analysis. The second one is called prose fiction analysis. And the third one is called a literary argument essay. Now, keep in mind, even though the essays come in this order, you don't necessarily need to do them in this order. You can do them in any order you want. And I think a good rule of thumb is to always start with the essay that seems easiest to you. because whichever one looks easiest is probably going to take you the least amount of time. It's going to stress you out the least. And it's a good way to just kind of get warmed up, right? And then you can work your way to what you think are the harder essays. And this is all personal, right? Some people might consider the literary argument essay to be the hardest just because it requires a lot of outside knowledge, whereas some people might find it a little nerve-wracking to analyze poetry. So if you're not crazy about poetry, then you might want to leave that essay for last. You have a total of 2 hours, which is a lot of time, but it's going to go by quickly when you have to crank out 3 essays. The suggestion is to spend 40 minutes on each essay. But actually, that's entirely up to you. You don't need to spend 40 minutes on each essay. You can budget the time however you want. And in fact, I think there's a good chance that one of these essays might take you a little bit longer than the other. So that's why I suggest you start with the easiest one first. So now that we've gone over the structure and the scoring of the AP, let's talk a little bit about how you can actually prepare for this. And of course, you've been preparing for this all year, right? You've been in your English class since the fall, and now it's April, so you're in the home stretch. And so you've already been practicing a lot in class. But what are some of the things you can do between now and test day? And we're going to talk about that now. Again, if you have any questions, just let me know by typing into the chat. Well, the first thing I'm going to give you is a nice little bonus. I'm going to give you the most important literary devices that you need to memorize. And keep in mind, there are perhaps more than what I have on this slide, but these are the ones that are really the most important and that are going to affect your score in the biggest way. So if you don't already have a list like this, you might want to just take a little screenshot of this slide, or maybe just take a minute to jot some of these things down, because these are the ones that really matter the most. And I'm even going to tell you the ones on this list that matter the most, okay? And that is, here they are: narration, metaphor, structure, setting, characterization, and I think I'm also going to put point of view on there too. Those are really the key ones. But if we take a look at an overview here, the reason I've highlighted a few of these is because they can show up in all sorts of passages, right? Like, we can see metaphors in poetry, but we can also see them in fiction. We can see a point of view in a poem, but we can also see it in fiction. Some of these other things, might be more particular to one type of writing or the other. But narration matters because you always need to ask yourself, who is telling the story? Who is speaking? In the case of a poem, sometimes it's the author speaking, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's somebody else. And if you can figure out who that is, that's always helpful. We have style and tone, which just refers to how the piece makes you feel, or whether you think it's written in a formal or casual style, maybe a humorous tone, maybe even a satirical tone, right? All of those things are possible. There's always a certain theme or focus, no matter what you're reading. Then we have diction. Diction really just means word choice. And words have a denotation, which is kind of the most obvious meaning, like a dictionary meaning, but then they also have a connotation, which is more like an implied meaning. And this is going to be especially important with poetry, right? Because poets often spend a lot of effort trying to choose just the right words. And you want to ask yourself, why did the poet choose these words? Then we have syntax, which just refers to grammar. How are the sentences put together? Imagery refers to usually visual images, but not always visual images. Sometimes things affecting the other senses, like smell or hearing. Hyperbole is deliberate exaggeration. This is a more particular one. You won't necessarily see hyperbole in everything you read, but if you do see it, it's worth noting. The opposite of hyperbole is understatement, wherein you deliberately soften or understate something, maybe for humor or sarcasm, that sort of thing. Similes and metaphors are both types of comparisons. Similes could be very common in poems. Um, Metaphors are a little less obvious because in a metaphor, the author is not using the words like or as. But if you can spot the metaphors, that always looks really good to the grader. We have symbolism, wherein something represents a greater idea or a different idea. Allusions are references to some outside knowledge, like history or Greek mythology, or perhaps a Christian reference, something that would require you to have a little outside knowledge on the subject matter. Satire involves the author poking fun at a certain idea, usually to make a political or social point. Irony is when events are the opposite of what you would expect them to be. This is more likely to show up in fiction than in a poem, but you never know. Analogies are simply comparisons between two things. Structure is something that's scattered throughout the entire piece of writing. So if it's a poem, ask yourself, what's the difference between the beginning, the middle, and the end of the poem? And if it's prose fiction, again, look at the beginning, middle, and end and see if you can spot any changes or contrast there. Ask yourself, what is the setting? This is usually relevant to fiction, but you never know. It could apply to a poem also. Paradoxes are things that are contradictions. Personification, you probably know, is taking an inanimate object and giving it human qualities. A juxtaposition is simply placing things side by side in order to compare them. Some English teachers will talk a lot about shifts too. A shift is a change. A juxtaposition is more like a side by side comparison, but it still involves contrasts. So that's what shifts and juxtapositions have in common. Then we have figurative language, in which something is not meant to be taken literally, right? Figurative is the opposite of a literal interpretation. And then finally, point of view and characterization. Characterization is often more relevant to fiction, but you never know. There could be some characters in your poems as well. Now, I'm going to add on two more important literary terms which apply only to poetry, and those are rhyme and form. Form simply refers to how the lines or stanzas are organized. Sometimes they're organized in a really predictable way, like in a sonnet. Sometimes there's a very loose form. And sometimes there's rhyme, sometimes there isn't, but it's always good to notice it when there is. Now, remember, the reason why these literary terms are important is for two reasons. First of all, you should be using these kinds of terms in your essays, particularly in the poetry analysis and prose fiction analysis essays, but you're also going to see these words show up in the multiple choice section. So if you see the word juxtaposition in one of the answers, you obviously have to know what that is. Now, this is not necessarily a complete list. You might have learned a bunch of other things in your class too, and that's all important. These are simply the ones that I think you're most likely to see on the test. So if you're looking for something fairly short to memorize, this would be the list to start with. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some general advice for all three of the essays. And then we will talk about each essay in a little bit more detail. But first, let's kind of start with the general things that you should do as much as possible. I would recommend for all three of these essays a 5-paragraph format. Now, technically, you don't have to do that. I mean, the College Board doesn't require 5 paragraphs. I'm just saying that in my experience, I think 5 paragraphs tends to work the best. And that's because if you're writing 5 paragraphs, you're typically writing a lot, which is always a good thing. The more, the better. It also means that your essay has some sort of structure. You're not just sort of throwing a bunch of ideas into one big paragraph. And so it's a good thing to aim for. Now, if for some reason you think that 5 paragraphs is just way too much, you could also get away with 4. But I think you should try 5 and see how it works for you. So that means the first paragraph is going to be an introduction. And in the first paragraph, you need to accomplish three important things. First, you need to start by introducing the subject, and try to grab the reader's attention if you can. If you can't, that's okay, but it's a nice touch if you come up with a catchy first line. It's just a way of telling the grader, hey, my essay is above average. You also need to introduce what you're discussing. What kind of poem are you discussing? What is it about? What is the prose fiction piece about? What is the topic that they're asking about in the literary question? And then this is key. You need to answer the question, because for all three of these essays, one of the things the grader is specifically looking for is a thesis. And if you don't have a thesis, there's no way you can get a 6. So I'm going to strongly suggest that you always put the thesis in paragraph 1. Make it obvious for the grader to find. And then after you present the thesis, quickly preview the evidence that you're going to use to support your ideas. Now, the evidence you use will depend on the essay. If it's poetry analysis, your evidence comes from lines in the poem. If it's prose fiction analysis, your evidence comes somewhere from the text. If it's the literary question, then the evidence is actually coming from your outside knowledge of literature, which is a little different, but you still need to provide evidence. Now, your first paragraph should not go off on wild tangents. You just don't have the time or space for that, and it could be distracting to the grader. It could make it hard to figure out what your thesis is. Don't ignore the prompt, right? Don't fail to have a thesis, because again, you'll automatically lose a point if you don't have a thesis, and you might even lose more than 1 point, because what happens is if you present evidence without a thesis, it's not clear how your evidence is backing anything up. And please do not merely restate the exact wording of the prompt as they gave it to you. That's not very creative, and the graders will start to notice when people are just quoting over and over again. So always state it in your own words. Now, after paragraph 1, which is the introduction, you're going to have body paragraphs. And like I said, ideally, you'll have 3 body paragraphs. Don't feel like you have to have more than 3, okay? Anything more than 3 is probably overkill. It probably means that you're trying to take on too much. And remember, we have to budget our time for 3 essays. So that's why 3 body paragraphs is often the ideal. Your body paragraphs should have clear transitions and topic sentences. Make it fairly simple to see how your essay is organized. Provide evidence. Now, sometimes it's appropriate to quote evidence directly. In other cases, it's better to paraphrase it. I think a good rule of thumb is that if you're quoting something short, like 10 words or less, that's fine. But if you're tempted to provide a much longer quote, you probably should be paraphrasing instead. I think quotes are necessary for the poem, right? Because in the poetry piece, usually you're just dealing with individual words or short phrases. When it comes to the prose fiction, that's when you want to be careful that you're not quoting incredibly long strings of sentences, because then it just starts to look like you're copying things. And in that case, it's better to paraphrase so that you can show the grader that you really understood what you read. But I think a good essay will always have a combination of quotes and paraphrasing. If you have no quotes, that's not a good thing. You're probably not providing enough evidence. But if you have extremely long quotes, that detracts from your ability to interpret things also. So try to find that balance between the two. And then here's the really important part. You need to explain how your evidence supports your point of view. The most common mistake that people make is to have evidence, but never actually explain it. Don't rely upon the grader to try to figure out how your evidence is relevant to the thesis, because unfortunately, you will not score maximum points unless you explain. It's better to over-explain than under-explain. To you, it might feel like over-explaining. To the grader, it might feel like you did just the right amount. So your body paragraphs should not simply rely on plot summary. This is a big mistake, because if all you do is summarize the poem or summarize the fiction piece, you're only showing the grader that you read it. You're not showing the grader that you're forming any important ideas from that. So unfortunately, you'll stay in the medium or average range scoring wise if you only do a bunch of plot summary or poetry summary. Or in the literary passage, if you only go on and on about the latest book you read, it's not going to do a lot for your score. You'll stay in the average range there. Don't let your quotations outweigh your own analysis. That's very important. And don't ramble on too much because, again, you've got to stick to about 40 minutes. You just don't have the luxury of spending too much time here. Now, the last paragraph will be a conclusion. First of all, you need to have a conclusion. If you don't have a conclusion, it makes your essay seem unfinished. Your conclusion will probably be either short or long, depending on how much time you feel you have. And by the way, I would suggest that you wear a watch while you're taking the AP, especially if you're taking the paper and pencil test. If you're taking the digital test, you will have a timer on the screen. But remember, you've got to do a little calculation about, how much time you've used up on that timer. So just to be on the safe side, I always think it's good to have a watch so you can keep track of your time easily. So leave time for a conclusion, sum up all the evidence, and if you do happen to think of anything new, feel free to write it into the conclusion. Some people think, well, I can't put anything new in the conclusion. That's not really true for AP essays. If you think of something really cool that you couldn't work into the other paragraphs, you can certainly work it into the conclusion as long as you have time. Your conclusion should not suggest that you ran out of time or that you didn't budget your time wisely. In other words, you shouldn't have no conclusion or just like a quick one sentence conclusion. And your conclusion shouldn't just restate the exact wording that you used in the introduction. That's not a good thing either. Find a slightly different way of saying what your thesis is. So, some other tips. If you are taking the paper test, please write legibly. Because remember, a real person is going to be reading this. And if that person can't read what you've written, that is a major problem. If your handwriting is extremely bad, that could even be a reason to get a 0. So just write as neatly as you can. Make sure the readers can see your paragraphs. So you should always obviously indent your paragraphs with a big indentation, because then it just looks more obvious that you have a paragraph. And if you're typing this, which you will be on the digital test, leave a space or indent between paragraphs. If you're handwriting, don't cross out too many things. A little bit of that is okay, but if you're scribbling out whole sentences and it looks really messy, it gets confusing. It's hard for the grader to grade what's there. So generally, and this goes mostly for handwriting, make sure your work looks neat, organized, and clear. But even if you're typing, of course, neatness is not a factor here, but organization is important, right? Make sure it's obvious where your paragraphs are. Try to make sure those paragraphs are roughly about the same length. They don't have to be exactly the same length, but you don't want to have like one huge paragraph followed by a really skinny one. That would look a little imbalanced, right? So it's always better to try to make your ideas look like they all got an equal amount of time and space. Okay, some more tips. Number one, make sure you understand the task in the prompt. I always think it's a good idea to read the prompt twice just to make sure you really understood it. Think about where the prompt takes you. In other words, okay, if this is true, what else might be true? Because those are the kinds of things that might get you a higher score. There's actually something called the sophistication point. The sophistication point is for people who thought a little bit more deeply about the subject. And so if you want to get that point, try to think a little beyond the prompt. Stake out a definite position, because they're virtually always asking you to make an interpretation or give your opinion on something. So be clear about that, right? Don't feel as though you have to be middle of the road or beat around the bush. You can be strong about your position. And by the way, whatever position you take, it doesn't have to represent your true opinions about the subject. It just has to be a position that you can defend with evidence. As long as you can defend it, it's perfectly fine. And remember, there are no right answers. It's not like the grader is looking for a particular slant on the issue. As long as you avoid saying things that are highly controversial, you should be fine. You can take any position you want. Always plan and organize before you start writing. You don't have to create a formal outline, but you just have to know generally, number one, what is your thesis? That's really important. I would even suggest you write down the thesis before you start writing the essay. And then also be clear about what major pieces of evidence you're going to use and in what order you're going to use them. On this type of essay, you should always start with your best evidence first. So your strongest point should be in paragraph 2. Don't leave the good stuff for last, because number one, you might start to run out of time. You don't want to run out of time on your weakest on your strongest point, right? You want to run out of time on your weakest point instead. So this might be the opposite of what you've done with some other essays. Always be clear and specific. So for example, when you're referring to something in the text, it's good to say paragraph 1 or in the second stanza or in the final line of the work or in the final line of the essay, something like that. Link each piece of evidence directly to your thesis. So name and explain, right? A lot of people will simply name evidence without explaining it, and explaining it really means linking it to your thesis. Always try to use correct grammar and paragraph construction, and watch your spelling. Now, technically, a little bit of spelling or grammar mistakes here and there isn't going to kill your score. But if it's really frequent, if the grader notices that, almost every sentence is grammatically incorrect and there's just tons of spelling mistakes, it is going to detract from the grader's ability to understand your ideas. And it's also going to cost you the sophistication point too. So just try to be conscious of that. Try to vary your sentence structure and the length of your sentences. Some people tend to write in overly simple sentences like, I have a cat. Her name is Fluffy. We love her very much. That's going to start to get boring, right? You want to combine ideas. You want to say, my cat Fluffy has been with us for 5 years and she's been a wonderful addition to the family. It sort of flows better, right? So that's what you're trying to do here. If you see an opportunity to use some advanced vocabulary, that's a great thing. You don't have to use words that you don't know, right? So don't be unnatural, but generally we do want these essays to be formal and academic in tone. We don't want them to be overly casual. We certainly don't want to be using things like abbreviations or anything that you might put in a text message. You have to keep this kind of high level. And then again, please write legibly if you're handwriting the essays. The grader will really appreciate that. And hey, graders are human, right? So we want to make them feel good and make it easy for them to give us a high score. So again, if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far, just feel free to type those questions into the chat field. And the final thing I just want to remind you of is at the end, it's always a good idea to proofread. So I would suggest you leave about a minute at the end of each essay to proofread. And if you even have a little extra time at the end, go back and proofread again. Now, if you're handwriting the essay, you don't want to be adding in a lot of new things because that's just going to look cluttered and it's going to, we shouldn't be writing up the margins and that sort of thing. But if you are typing the essay, as you will be on a digital test, then you do have the ability to add things in at the last minute if you want to. So proofreading is just a way to catch any of your mistakes and to see if anything's missing. Okay, so overall, what do we have to do to get a high score on any of these essays? Well, really, it's fairly simple. We just have to write an essay that is obviously better than average. We don't have to write a perfect essay. The grader understands that you only had about 40 minutes to write each one of these things. This is not going to be the best writing you've ever done in your life, but you just have to make the grader think that you were a little better than average, because then you can get to that 5 or 6 level. If your essay kind of looks like everyone else's, then you're more likely to get that 3 or 4. And so make it easy for the scorer to think your essay is good. That's things like writing a lot, writing with an obvious structure, having a clear and somewhat complex thesis statement, and start with that opening line that looks like a grabber, something that makes you want to read the essay. The graders love that. And of course, writing style has something to do with this too. And so how do you make sure you get a 6? Well, really it comes down to these things. You have to go a little deeper with your thesis. You have to provide more examples. So for instance, a lot of people only use 1 or 2 examples. That's why I'm suggesting you use 3. You have to flesh out those examples in pretty good detail. Always put things in context. And also be aware that there's a certain amount of tension. What that means is, even though you are asserting an idea, you are asserting a thesis, you have to acknowledge that there's another side to the issue. There are people who might disagree with you. You have to show that you're aware of those opposing points of view and perhaps even explain them away. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the College Board specifically says is that to score the sophistication point, you have to show that you've considered the other side of the argument. It doesn't mean you have to ride the fence. You can still have a strong position, but you need to show that you understand the opposing position. But here's the good news. Even if you really struggle with these essays, if you're taking an AP class, if you're coming to this session and you're doing some practice on your own and you're learning those literary terms that we talked about, you're almost guaranteed to get at least a 3, right? Because the people who get 1s and 2s, really, they just don't put in a lot of effort. So that's the good news. You're not going to get a 1 or a 2 if you're putting in the effort. But what we're trying to do really is try to help you to get an above average score. That's really where everyone wants to be. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a closer look at each one of the essays that shows up in section 2. As we said, there are 3 of them, and they come in a particular order, but you don't need to answer them in that order if you don't want to. The first one is always the poetry analysis question. So here they're going to give you either 1 longer poem or 2 shorter poems. And they do tend to be fairly long. You know, they're not just like a little Emily Dickinson poem. There's usually more to it than that. If they did give you an Emily Dickinson poem, then they'd probably match it up with some other poem that was a bit longer. So what is your task? Well, they're going to ask you a specific question. Whatever that question is, you have to respond to that question with a defensible interpretation. In other words, a thesis, right? All of these essays require a strong thesis. And remember that your thesis often comes down to either agreeing with the prompt statement, disagreeing with the prompt statement, or taking a kind of middle of the road or modifying approach to the statement. So you can say whatever you want as long as it answers the question and as long as it's reasonable and you can back it up. And of course, you know, as long as it's non-controversial and is not, the grader's not going to think it's strange in some way. Select and use evidence to support this thesis. So like I said, you need about 3 pieces of evidence. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. And then, of course, watch out for the grammar, punctuation, spelling, etc., etc. So the 2 most important things you need to ask yourself when you're looking at the poem is, what is the meaning of the poem? Now, we know how poems are, right? Sometimes this is tricky. What is the meaning of the poem? Sometimes you have to read it twice before you can even guess at what the meaning of the poem is. So that's okay. Give yourself permission to do that. As a matter of fact, I usually suggest people spend 3 to 5 minutes just reading the text and coming up with ideas. So if you don't get it the first time, read it again. And then once you think you understand the meaning, ask yourself, how do I know that? Because whatever it is that you could try to prove to yourself what the meaning is, those are the kinds of things that you should be talking about in your essay. But of course, you also have to relate it to whatever question they're asking you as well. So that's essay number one, poetry analysis. Then we have essay number two, prose fiction analysis. The basic tasks here are the same. The only difference is the passage will be a fairly long excerpt from prose fiction, about 500 to 700 words. So we're talking several paragraphs, right? So it's going to take you a while to read that. It's probably going to take longer than it would take to read the poem. That's okay. Read the whole thing. And most importantly, read the question that they're asking you. You need to respond to that question with, again, a defensible interpretation, which really means a thesis. It's always about the thesis. Decide what evidence you're going to use to support that thesis. Again, 3 pieces of evidence is suggested. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. And again, watch out for the grammar, punctuation, and spelling wherever possible. Just like with the poem, what you're always asking yourself is, what is the meaning of this fiction piece? And how do I know it? Look for the evidence that gave you those clues. Now, the third essay is rather different. It's called the literary argument question. What's different about this is you will not be given a passage. You will not be given a text or a poem. You will simply be given a question to answer. And what the College Board expects you to do is use your own knowledge of literature, in particular novels, to answer the question. Now, what's interesting about these questions is along with the question, they will give you a long list of books. They usually put about 30 or 40 books on the page. But keep in mind, you do not need to use any of those books. Those books are just suggestions. If you have another book that you've read that you're comfortable with and you think it's relevant to the question, please use that book. The only reason to even read the list of books that they give on the page is if you can't come up with any ideas. Let's say you know everything there is to know about The Great Gatsby, but you look at the question they're asking and you can't make any connections to The Great Gatsby. Oh no, what do I do? Well, then in that case, you want to read through the list of books that they have there, because some of those may be books that you've read and that you can speak about intelligently, and it may kind of jog your memory. So, how can you be successful with the literary argument essay? Well, I think it's really important sometime before the test to just sit down and make a list of all the novels you've read in your class that you know really well. You might even have some novels that you read last year in an English class that you know really well. Write them all down and make sure you're just bone up on the details. Like, what were the character names? For instance, I just looked at a prompt today and I thought, oh, the book Emma by Jane Austen would work really well. But then I realized I couldn't remember the name of Emma's boyfriend in the book. And that would be kind of embarrassing. It would be kind of embarrassing if I just had to call him Emma's boyfriend, right? That's a little awkward. So it's nice if you know some of the major character names. You obviously have to remember the basics of the plot, right? What was the beginning? What was the ending? What were some of the major themes? And I would say if you have, 5 or 10 books that you know really well, there's a good chance you're going to be able to use one of them for this essay. You might even think of multiple books that could work for this essay. And of course, you've been reading books in your class, right? So those would be the most obvious ones to use, but you can use any other books you want. Remember, you don't have to use one of the books that's on the list. You can use any book you want. But I would suggest that you use books that are reasonably well known and are considered literary works, right? You probably don't want to use your favorite Stephen King novel. That's probably not going to work very well. You want to stick to things that are considered, a kind of high literature or things that would be read by the average high school student in an English class. Let's put it that way. So once you decide how you're going to respond to the prompt, and decide what book you're going to use, select and use evidence from that book to support your thesis, explain how the evidence supports your thesis, and of course, grammar, punctuation, and spelling do count to some extent. So here, the two most important things to ask yourself are, what is my thesis? And that should be in paragraph 1. And how can I prove it using the book that I'm going to use? And make sure the book is a good fit, right? It doesn't have to be your favorite book. It just has to be a book that you know something about that seems to fit. But I think if you're clever, you can actually make a lot of books fit, right? Because a lot of books have multiple themes, multiple characters. There might be little details that happened, and you can use aspects of that for lots of different prompts. So get creative. Even if you feel like it's a weird prompt, there may be a way of stretching one of your sources to fit if you're clever about the way you write it. So these are the 3 essay prompts. Now, in our next session, we're going to do a spotlight on some of these in a little more depth. So if you're thinking about how to actually tackle these essays, and if there's one in particular you're having trouble with, we will definitely cover that. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about what we do at the Princeton Review. First of all, the best place to find us is at princetonreview.com. But you can also give us a call on the phone if you want to. We're at 800-2-REVIEW, and we have people that are ready to talk to you virtually all day long. We offer a couple of useful things that are going to help you with your AP prep. Number 1, we offer AP tutoring one-on-one with teachers just like me. And these teachers are available on your schedule. They can give you good feedback on your essays or help you out with multiple choice. So that's one really good option. And somebody asked a good question. What are the best study methods to use rather than what material? Okay, so I'm not sure exactly which essay you're talking about. Maybe you were talking about the literary argument essay, maybe. I'm not sure, I don't know if I understand your question, but we're definitely going to talk more about specific strategies in the next live stream. We have 2 more live streams next week. So if you do have a really specific essay that you're talking about there, just let me know next time and we can definitely get deeper into that. But like I say, it's the study methods pretty much come down to learning literary terms and also doing practice essays. And there's a good chance that you've been doing some practice essays in your classes. But that's why we offer things like cram courses, because our AP cram courses give you even more of a chance to do more practice and meet with a teacher for 6 hours, covering even more of this in detail. So let's say you've been learning a lot at home. Maybe you're not in school with your teacher that much and you feel like you need more access to a teacher. That's what we're here for. Part of our courses involve our excellent Cracking the AP books. So if you sign up for the English literature test, you'll get a book called Cracking the AP English Literature. It looks a lot like the ones that I have on the slide here. And we actually have the 2021 editions hot off the presses. You can also find this book at any major bookstore. So if you just want to work out of a book and you don't feel like you need any tutoring or a course, this is a great way to practice. There are lots of practice tests and practice questions, and we explain everything you need to know about the test. So it was a real pleasure working with all of you. Thank you for attending this first live stream. Just a reminder that we have 2 more live streams next week on Monday and Tuesday. So I'll see you soon.